Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into something fundamental to the U.S. presidency.
Yeah, the 22nd Amendment.
Yeah.
The one that, limits presidents to 2 terms.
Exactly. And our mission here is to go a bit deeper than just the basics. We want you to really understand the history, the arguments, the implications, basically get you fully up to speed.
For sure. We've pulled together quite a range of material insights from the National Constitution Center, DebateUS, factcheck.org.
Project Tahoe, DWS, Forbes, that Economist YouGov poll, Wikipedia for background, PBS, even a Reddit thread that had some interesting points.
And here's a kicker to start with. The Constitution, the original one. No term limits for the president.
Right. Seems wild now.
Totally. The whole 2-term thing, that was George Washington. But it wasn't law. It was his choice. He wanted out. Partly because, well, politics was getting nasty.
Okay, let's unpack that a bit. No term limits originally. That feels risky. What was the thinking back at the Constitutional Convention?
Well, remember, they just dealt with King George III. So there was this huge fear of creating another really strong, potentially tyrannical executive.
Ah, right. Fear of a monarchy 2.0.
Exactly. They debated term lengths. Should they be re-eligible? Some even floated like a single long term or even lifetime tenure.
Wow, lifetime.
Yeah. But they settled on 4 years. And crucially, no explicit cap on re-election.
So Washington decides 2 terms is enough for him. How did that become such a powerful, unwritten rule? Was it just him being noble?
Well, his integrity was part of it, definitely. He did want to go back to private life. But also, the political scene was getting really divided. These factions were forming, and he was getting uncomfortable.
So a mix of personal desire and political reality.
Pretty much. And it's not even clear he meant to set a hard and fast rule forever. But guys like Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, they looked at what he did and thought, yeah, that's actually a good idea.
A salutary precedent, I think Jefferson called it.
That's the phrase. Jefferson, in fact, thought the lack of term limits was one of the Constitution's 2 worst defects. He was really concerned about it.
Okay, so it's this strong tradition, but just a tradition, a kind of gentleman's agreement held for, what, nearly 150 years?
Right. Until FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt.
The big exception, elected 4 times.
Exactly. 3rd term, then a 4th term, during the Depression and World War II. And that was the catalyst. That's when people really started saying, okay, maybe this tradition needs to be actual law.
The fear of too much power in one person's hands for too long?
Precisely. The idea that, a republic needs rotation in office. So that led directly to the push for a constitutional amendment.
Which brings us to the 22nd Amendment itself. Passed by Congress in 47, ratified by 51. What are the key parts? What does it actually say?
Okay, so Section 1 is the core. It says pretty plainly, no person shall be elected to the office of the president more than twice. Simple enough?
Twice elected. Got it.
But it also covers someone taking over midterm, like a vice president, if you serve more than 2 years of someone else's term.
Ah, okay. If you step in early.
Right. If you serve more than 2 years of that term, then you can only be elected president one more time on your own.
Makes sense. So it prevents someone from serving potentially almost 3 full terms through succession.
Exactly. It caps the total potential time around 10 years, roughly.
And was there any thought given to the guy in charge when this was all happening, Truman?
Yeah, there was. They included what's called a grandfather clause. It specifically said the amendment wouldn't apply to the sitting president when it was proposed by Congress.
So Harry Truman could have run again in 52?
Technically, yes. The amendment didn't block him, but he chose not to run.
Okay. So the amendment's in place, part of the Constitution for, what, over 70 years now? But the debate isn't over, is it? Let's talk about the arguments for keeping these term limits.
Sure. A big one is preventing political stagnation. The idea that power shouldn't consolidate around one person indefinitely. Rotation in office, basically.
Like Jefferson, Jackson, even JFK later on, they all seem to favor that idea, right?
Absolutely.
Yep.
Jefferson's warning was stark. He worried unlimited terms could eventually become like an inherited position. And you have to wonder, with things changing so fast today, does that risk of a leader getting out of touch become even more relevant?
That's a fair point. And the argument is, look, 8 years is a good chunk of time. If your policies are solid, the next person can build on them.
Right. Effective policies should ideally survive a change in leadership. Plus, proponents say term limits bring in fresh perspectives, new ideas, maybe even reduce the chance for corruption that can come with long-term incumbency.
Monroe thought the tradition itself had become strong just because it worked, because people liked it.
Yeah, he felt it proved its own value, its salutary nature, as he put it. Public opinion solidified it even before the amendment.
Okay, compelling points for keeping it. But what about the other side? Why do people argue against the 22nd Amendment?
Well, the most fundamental argument against it goes right back to democracy itself. It's the idea that the people should decide.
The voters should have the ultimate say.
Exactly. Why should the Constitution tell voters, sorry, you can't vote for this person you might really want just because they've already served twice? The original Constitution, remember, trusted the people on this.
So it's a restriction on voter choice. What else?
The other major concern is the lame duck problem.
Ah, yes. The second-term president who supposedly loses all their clout because they can't run again.
Right. The argument is that knowing they're on their way out weakens their influence, both at home, trying to get legislation passed, and, maybe more importantly, internationally.
Yeah, I can see that. If you're negotiating with other world leaders and they know you'll be gone in a year or two, does your leverage decrease?
Potentially, yes. Why make a long-term deal with someone who won't be around to see it through or enforce it? It could mean the U.S. is effectively less powerful on the world stage for, say, the last quarter of every presidency that hits the limit.
That's a significant potential downside.
And, Federalist Paper No. 72, written way back by Hamilton, argued against term limits for this very reason. He said the possibility of re-election is a huge incentive for a president to do a good job.
Take away the reward, you diminish the motivation.
That was his thinking. Term limits remove that incentive, potentially making presidents less accountable, maybe less likely to tackle tough, long-term issues. And you had people like Reagan later saying flat out, it interferes with the people's right to choose.
And didn't President Clinton float an idea about non-consecutive terms?
Yeah, he suggested that with people living longer, maybe allowing someone to come back after a break with more experience could be beneficial. It's an interesting thought, trying to balance experience with the principle of limits.
Okay, let's circle back to that lame duck idea. It's a common critique, but how true is it in practice? Do second-term presidents always fade out?
Well, it's not always clear-cut. Our sources point to Eisenhower, for instance. People expected him to be a lame duck in his second term.
But he wasn't.
Apparently not. He actually seemed quite vigorous, got things done, even dealing with a Congress controlled by the Democrats. So it shows that being term limited doesn't automatically mean you lose all your power. Leadership style, circumstances, political skill, they all play a role.
So it's context dependent.
It seems so. However, some analysis, like from DWS, looking at the current political landscape, they suggest something different.
What's that?
They argue that, especially if you have candidates running who are already term limited from previous service, like a potential Biden or Trump scenario again, the winner might become a lame duck almost immediately.
Because everyone knows right from day one they absolutely cannot run again in 4 years.
Exactly. Their future political capital is inherently limited. This could, theoretically, make the election itself less consequential for big, long-term policy shifts. Why would the opposition cooperate much if they know they just have to wait the president out?
Does today's intense polarization make that worse? Maybe. Less incentive than ever to work with the president on their way out.
That's a really important question. It's quite possible that polarization magnifies the lame duck effect.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting and maybe a bit confusing. Are there potential loopholes, unanswered questions about how the 22nd Amendment actually works?
Yes. This is a fascinating legal and constitutional gray area. The big question, based on our sources like factcheck.org and that Reddit discussion, is this. Does the amendment limit how many times you can be elected, or does it put an absolute cap on serving as president no matter how you get there?
Elected versus serving. Okay, that sounds like a lawyer's distinction, but it could be huge. What are the scenarios where someone could potentially serve again without being elected the third time?
Well, several possibilities get discussed. The most talked about one involves a former, twice-elected president running for and winning the vice presidency.
Wait, really? A former president as VP?
Theoretically. Then if the sitting president were to resign, die, or be removed from office, the VP becomes president.
So they'd be back in the Oval Office, having served 2 terms already, but without being elected to a third term.
Correct. Another path is through the 25th Amendment. If the president becomes temporarily unable to discharge their duties, the VP acts as president. A former president serving as VP could find themselves acting president under those circumstances.
Okay, hold on. Can a twice-elected president even be vice president? Doesn't the 12th Amendment say something about that?
You've hit the nail on the head. That's the crux of the legal debate. The 12th Amendment says no one constitutionally ineligible to be president can be vice president.
And the 22nd makes you ineligible to be elected president a third time.
Right, so the question is, does being ineligible for election make you constitutionally ineligible for the office itself, in the sense the 12th Amendment means? Or could you still serve if you got there through succession as VP?
So it's ambiguous. Lawyers disagree.
Very much so. There isn't a definitive Supreme Court ruling on it. It hinges on interpreting the precise meaning of elected in the 22nd and ineligible in the 12th.
Wow. Okay. What about less likely scenarios?
There are others related to presidential succession. The 20th Amendment covers situations like the president-elect dying before taking office. The VP-elect then becomes president.
So if a former president was VP-elect.
They could become president that way, or if no president is chosen or qualified by Inauguration Day, the VP-elect acts as president. And then there's the Presidential Succession Act itself, the line of succession beyond the VP. Theoretically, a former president could be placed somewhere in that line, maybe as Speaker of the House or Secretary of State, and end up back in charge if disaster struck.
It seems like there are more potential pathways, however unlikely, than you might initially think.
It does suggest the amendment might not be as ironclad a barrier to serving again as people assume. And that Reddit discussion, it brought up enforcement concerns too, especially thinking about recent legal challenges like Trump v. Anderson over the 14th Amendment.
What was the worry there? How does that connect?
The concern was about process and authority. Like, who decides if someone is ineligible under the 22nd? Can states block someone from the ballot based on it? Could Congress refuse to count electoral votes for a candidate they deem ineligible under the 22nd Amendment during the official count?
So questions about how the limit would actually be enforced if challenged.
Exactly. It highlights the complex interaction between constitutional provisions, state election laws, and congressional procedures. And some on that Reddit thread even speculated. Maybe the specific wording, shall be elected, was chosen deliberately.
To leave these other doors open. Intentionally.
It's speculation, of course.
Yeah.
But it's a provocative thought that maybe the amendment was focused narrowly on election, not on absolutely barring service through other constitutional means.
Okay, let's bring this into the here and now. Obviously, Donald Trump has served 2 non-consecutive terms. So under the 22nd Amendment,
He cannot be elected president again. That part is clear.
but we still hear talk, see Trump 2028 stuff. How does that fit? Is it just ignoring the Constitution, or are they thinking about these loopholes?
Well, he can't be elected. But the VP scenario, or those other succession routes we discussed, while constitutionally debated and perhaps unlikely, remain theoretical possibilities. And we did see that proposal from Representative Andy Ogles earlier this year.
I want to change the Constitution.
Yeah, a proposed amendment to explicitly allow a third term if the first 2 weren't consecutive, which, was widely seen as being aimed at potentially allowing Trump to run again via election.
But what's the real political mood for actually changing the 22nd Amendment? Is there any momentum for that?
Looking at recent polling, like that Economist YouGov data from April 2025, it suggests Trump's approval ratings dipped in his second term, some pushback on policies like tariffs. That might indicate that the political capital needed for a major push to repeal or significantly alter the 22nd Amendment. Well, it might be harder to muster right now.
Public opinion would be key, presumably.
Absolutely. Amending the Constitution is a very high bar. And the DWS analysis also pointed out, looking ahead to 2028, regardless of who wins any election before then, neither Biden nor Trump could run in 2028 because of the 22nd Amendment. They both hit their limit on being elected.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. We've covered a lot of ground on the 22nd Amendment.
Yeah, we've seen it came about because of FDR breaking that long-held tradition started by Washington. It formalized the 2-term limit.
But it's still debated. Does it weaken presidents in their second term? Does it wrongly limit voter choice?
Right. And then there are these really fascinating, unresolved constitutional questions about whether it only applies to election or if it absolutely bars serving again, especially through the vice presidency or succession.
Which leads to a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. Considering these potential scenarios, the VP route, the succession possibilities, does the 22nd Amendment really fulfill its goal of definitively limiting executive power? Or are there ways around its spirit, if not its exact letter?
What would it mean for the balance of power, for the whole idea behind the amendment, if one of those non-elected pathways was actually used by a former 2-term president?
Something to ponder. We hope this deep dive gave you a much richer understanding of the 22nd Amendment, its history, the arguments surrounding it, and the intriguing questions it still raises today.
Definitely. Think about those arguments, the history, the potential future twists, and form your own view. Thanks for joining us.